All right, I would like to welcome everybody to today's webinar, in which we will be discussing the distributional effects of gas price volatility and potential policy mitigations. We're delighted to have an excellent panel that's been performing work under a UKIRK project. And I'd like to hand over to Monica Giulietti of the University of Nottingham to provide an introduction to the webinar. My name is Sean Ennis. I'm the director of the Center for Competition Policy at the University of East Anglia.
Many thanks, Sean. Thanks for introducing our webinar. I'm Monica Giulietti, professor of industrial economics at the University of Nottingham Business School. And I will be taking you through the plan for today's webinar. I would like, first of all, to thank my colleagues here who will take part with me in this panel, all the participants, and the CCP team that has helped us organize this webinar. So today we'll have three presentations based on the research work done as part of the UKIRK-funded project on gas price volatility. This was a project that was supposed to last 18 months. It actually got extended due to organizational issues, but it has also allowed us to look into more detail to the main issue that was the focus of this research, the energy crisis that we saw starting from 2022. I would like to mention that throughout the project, we have had the support and engagement of the National Energy Action that has been extremely helpful and supportive in developing the work we have done over these months. The research project is looking at issues that we consider still current with the policy discussion about energy bills more generally, but it relates also to a broader issue, which is how to engage society in the transition to a net zero economy. And all our presentations today will cover these issues. I will therefore start my presentation with, if I can find the right screen now, which will be this one, hopefully. So the three presentation will start with my discussion of two research pieces of work relating to distributional issues, followed by Dr. Burlinson's presentation that will look at energy prices and consumption based on information from smart meter data. And finally, Professor Harker and Dr. Kohn will take a more institutional and legal approach to the discussion of the net zero transition based on their work on that relies on a series of interviews with key stakeholders in the sector. So starting with my first discussion, this is based on joint work with other colleagues from universities that were involved in the research project. And the main focus of the work is this idea of energy price resilience, which is a concept and a definition, a framework that we have established to identify potential tools to assess the effect of recent price shocks. And the work has then been extended looking at socioeconomic issues that are associated with the process of adopting low carbon technology. The presentation will end with some general policy consideration across the two pieces of research work. So to start with the background to this piece of work, The context was concern for affordability issues associated with the evidence of energy bills that to this day remain high. We've recently heard about a further increase in energy prices starting from October in the energy price cap, evidence of arrears and debt, particularly without specific arrangement for repayments being on the increase. And in terms of the tools to protect consumers against the potential effects of price rises, measures and interventions supporting energy efficiencies have flatlined. In particular, I wanted to focus on a problem that National Energy Action has highlighted starting from the year 2020, so even before the recent crisis, which was labeled as a gathering storm of utility web. These diagrams that represent, I believe, the most recent evidence provided by Ofgem about the number of accounts in arrears and the average monetary value of the arrears where no arrangement has been made to repay the debt, show a concerning increase, although in the most recent quarter, it appears that the numbers of accounts in arrears seems to be declining, hopefully a positive sign at least. This research focused on this objective of trying to conceptualize an idea of energy price resilience. So how confident and secure can consumers be in the presence of unexpected changes to prices? And our analysis of the literature and our reflections of the issues have led us to identify two main channels that might be used in order to identify a way of measuring and quantifying this concept of resilience. We've identified a thermal comfort dimension and a financial security dimension, and I will explain these in more details in a minute. As a consequence of having identified this potential measure of resilience, we've also attempted to look at the relationship that this measure has with physical and mental health, despite the fact that actually energy poverty in general and physical conditions have been established as related problems in a rather wide literature. And finally, we also considered elements of potential sources of socio-economic inequality in the adoption of low-carbon technologies, which might represent a form of protection against unexpected and substantial changes in energy prices. So to move on to our own proposed definition of energy price resilience, we've identified an initial framework that basically goes from energy price events, filtered through the elements of energy bills, incomes, and energy efficiency that will affect what we identify as resilience, allowing consumers to maintain thermal comfort and financial security, and eventually having an impact on their general health and well-being. This has led us to identify or propose a definition of energy price resilience as the ability to maintain or retain sufficient levels of thermal comfort and or financial security in the face of energy price events. We then decided to use this measure to identify the extent of concerns in this area within the GB market, actually UK, UK market using a representative panel of the UK population as captured by the Understanding Society survey. We've relied on 2 waves of this survey covering the period between January 2016 to May 2022, and therefore, as a word of caution, not capturing the most potentially most substantial impact of the Ukrainian crisis or energy price crisis, which basically were experienced in the winter 2022-23. This is a large panel of individuals of about 20,000 households represented by the one representative individuals, and it's equivalent to about 100,000 observations. So what do we find? Starting from our first component of this measure of energy price resilience, so the thermal comfort, through the evidence that's available in the Understanding Society survey, we've identified 2 variables, one quantitative and one perception-based, that in our view can capture the idea of the thermal comfort. So identifying those households that spend 10% of their income on energy, and also those who are unable to keep their that they're unable to keep their property warm. And within our sample, 20% of households experience both or either of these problems. In terms of financial security, again, one more quantitative and one more perception-based measure. So individuals finding it difficult to manage their finances, and then households who are actually behind with their bills. And here, 10% of our household experience one or the other. Moving on to the big picture, let's say, we have identified that overall, across all the households captured in the survey, 25% have had experience of low energy price resilience. And this can be represented by an element associated with financial solvency, which is highlighted here as LES, or with energy affordability, which we identified as LEA, also in the rest of the results that I will present in a minute. So first of all, we looked at what socioeconomic characteristics might be associated by these low levels of resilience. And we've identified that the inability to save or the lack of access to savings is one relevant factor. Prepayment meters are also associated with this low level of resilience, and other socioeconomic characteristics or element of, let's say, deprivation associated with unemployment, retirement, single parenthood, and the nature of rented accommodation. We then split our analysis into the 2 components, affordability and financial resilience. And we find that prepayment meters are generally associated with energy affordability mainly. Also that retirees are affected mainly on the dimension of, let's say, thermal comfort, while those in temporary or insecure jobs experience both. The nature of rented accommodation affects affordability as well. And finally, looking at the well-being, and in particular mental well-being, we've identified basically low levels of life satisfaction and distress in adults, but also low levels of life satisfaction among children and young adults. And this is a novel results compared to the established literature. And then before making any considerations of policy, I will move on in being aware of time constraint to the next bit of the study, which looks instead at socioeconomic factor that might influence the ability to adopt low carbon technologies. In general, we've seen in recent years that low carbon technologies, particularly solar panels and electric vehicles, have become more affordable, but for a large share of the population, these remain unaffordable, particularly for the most vulnerable. Also for this study, we use the Understanding Society survey as before, but we look at periods that are even before what we've just seen. And this is because the questions relating to low carbon technologies are proposed infrequently to the participants. And so the only two waves that we were able to capture these phenomena were in 2012-14 and 2018-2020. So we decided to look at the changes over this period of time, potentially identifying some improvement over time. And we're looking at a sample of about 40,000 households. The method used by us basically focuses on circumstances that are beyond an individual's control, being aware that the decision to adopt any technologies will depend on individual circumstances, on their personal choices and efforts, and an element of pure chance. But our focus is on predetermined characteristics, in particular associated with childhood circumstances. Our results, for a quick summary, indicate that over the two periods of times that we have compared, the inequality driven by socioeconomic factors in adopting these technologies has been decreasing. So that's certainly a positive outcome. But we've also identified some critical socioeconomic factors that influence the ability and decision to adopt. And we found that the most dominant factors are an individual's education, their parents' occupation and education, and for the case of solar panels, age also plays a part, quite a significant component of this socioeconomic inequality. And then to finish off with some policy consideration, in general, over the time of the energy crisis, we have seen government interventions that were universal. And the removal of this universal form of support had offered an opportunity to devise or develop and introduce more targeted forms of intervention. And we think that our contribution could inform policies that are more targeted. Of course, now we are hearing concerns about what is happening with pensioners, for example, and that's obviously one area that highlights how complex it can be to identify the most vulnerable and how to support them. Based on our results, we can also say that targeting particular socioeconomic groups can also help to reduce the inequalities that we've identified in the adoption of energy efficient technologies. And more generally, that policy interventions that aim to be targeted should take all these complex and interrelated factors into account. As a general line of guidance, means testing alone seems to be a rather limited tool to try and identify who needs the support and how the support can be made most effective. And I think this covers my presentation. So this work that I've just briefly discussed is covered in one published article, which is open access, so can be seen by everyone, published in Energy Economics, and then on a working paper that is available on the UKER website and can also be accessed by everyone, by the public. And I think now I will pass on to Andrew for his presentation. I believe we'll be taking questions at the end. Thank you. I'll need to stop sharing, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Monica. Right, here we go. So, okay, so hopefully you can see okay. So this brings us on to the next work package that we've been carrying out as part of the UKER project. I'd like to just reiterate Monica's thanks to NEA, in particular, Matt Copeland and Dion, but also Matthew Scott, who was at NEA, and I can notice he's also in the participant list as well. So this particular piece of work relies on a natural experiment, and it speaks to two elements. One, the energy price crisis that started to emerge towards the end of 2021, which impacted suppliers and also consumers through their ability to switch and started to feed into prices, but also the energy price crisis that really kicked off once we saw energy price volatility or gas price volatility really peak up once Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. So let's have a look. So there's a quick roadmap. I'm not going to go into all the details of the energy price crisis. I imagine most people on this call will know, but I'm going to tease out a few particular elements that we rely on, not only in terms of our empirical strategy, but also in terms of our policy implications as well. This feeds into our research questions, the research design, and we'll discuss a bit about data methodology and findings too. So just to give you an idea of what's going on behind our empirical strategy, we know that towards the end of 2021, in particular compared to Europe, we started to see, or the UK at least started to see the start of an energy price crisis towards the end of 2021. And this can be seen not only in terms of the 30 or so suppliers that exited the market, but also the impact this had on energy prices for those on a direct debit fuel tariffs, dual fuel tariffs, as we can see by the blue line, that were considered fixed. Compared to those on a standard variable tariff that follows quite closely, in particular those on the cheapest tariff, represented by the yellow dash, that follows closely the default tariff cap, followed by the black dots. And we can see that there is an exponential increase in the fixed tariffs by the end of 2021 and into 2022, and essentially a collapse in switching or availability of these tariffs for a period of time into 2023. So this is important for several reasons, because over 2 million households whose suppliers exited the market were forced onto a standard variable tariff. And there was limited options to actually switch back to a fixed tariff for several reasons we're going to discuss. So as we can see in Ofgem statistics, that there was a cliff edge in terms of switching from the hundreds of thousands of households switching gas and electricity before October 2021 into the tens of thousands throughout 2022 and beyond. So this is important not only to understand the initial phases of the energy price crisis that precluded the April 2022 price increase, but also our empirical framework as well. So we know that the cap wasn't the only thing that was protecting consumers during this period of time. As we're going to see in our results, the energy price guarantee also plays a particular role when we look at at least the visual aspect of our analysis. And we know the energy price guarantee kept prices or average bills below the energy price cap for a period of time until the price cap took over as prices started to fall into 2023 and beyond. So let's have a look how This actually feeds into not only our research question, but also our research design. So we have two key questions. The first one was trying to identify the impact of the energy price crisis on GB energy consumption. And most of you are probably thinking, well, consumers reduce their gas and electricity, but the key question that we have is by how much? We actually don't know, because we don't observe the data or the world in which the energy price crisis didn't actually occur. So we need to think carefully about this particular, what we call a counterfactual. We're also interested in what potential savings for consumers who are lucky enough to remain on fixed tariffs throughout. And we look at this not only in terms of the perception of consumption, but also expenditure as well. So we're going to answer these research questions using a difference in differences framework, or the natural experiment that we've started to allude to in the previous slides. So what is the research design? Well, we leverage smart meter data, which is innovative in itself. So we use millions of observations that define households' daily gas and electricity consumption in order to analyze the causal effect of the energy price crisis on their consumption. And we design a counterfactual using the information that we have on prices in the following way. We have two groups. The first one is households whose energy prices vary during the crisis. We define these as the treated group, i.e. those that were exposed to the energy price crisis post-April 2022, given that their tariffs were fixed before April 2022. And we're going to compare those to households who were lucky enough to have their tariffs fixed not only before April 2022, but beyond. And that's what we call our counterfactual or control group. So we're trying to compare as close as we can, apples to apples here. So we're looking at households who had similar characteristics potentially, and we're going to check that, but were forced onto variable tariffs, either because their suppliers exited the market or they were unlucky enough that their tariff ended during this period of time and they were unable to switch to a cheaper fixed tariff because they're unavailable. So just to give you a flavor of the sample statistics, and just to show you, because this data is relatively novel, that it's actually reliable too. So on average, households in our sample consume around about 12,000 kilowatt hours per year of gas and around about 3,200 kilowatt hours of electricity. And this is just to tell you that this is in the ballpark of DESNZ and Ofgem's, what they call the typical domestic consumption values, that are usually used to kind of as the headline figures of what's happening in terms of energy bills for average consumers that you see reported in the news and elsewhere. For those who are interested in the more statistical element of this, we use a transformation of consumption in order to measure, let's say, the responsiveness or elasticity of households, but also we are able to keep zeros. This is inverse hyperpodic sine transformation. So you'll see that transformation of electricity consumption on this y-axis over here, and we observe, or I'm going to show you the trends of electricity and gas consumption, but also prices, in order to kind of show you a bit more clearly what's going on behind the empirical model or framework that we rely upon. So we have the patterns of gas and electricity consumption between 2021 and 2023 for two key groups. One we call the FF group, that is the fixed group, i.e. those who are on a fixed tariff throughout the entirety of our sample, and those who were on a fixed tariff, that's defined by the red line, and then were unlucky enough to have been forced onto, or their contract ended and were unable to switch back to a fixed tariff. So they're on a variable tariff post-April 2022. We also highlight the energy price guarantee here, just to kind of give you a flavor of that. Look, gas and electricity consumption between these two groups, i.e. those on variable tariff exposed to the energy price crisis, actually started to coalesce and then started to diverge once the energy price guarantee ended towards the end of, or the summer and the end of 2023. We see a similar pattern, similar in consumption values for these two groups prior to the April price cap. And again, there's some divergence, but again, this real divergence starts to be observed once the energy price guarantee ends in June 2023. So again, we see some impact on gas and electricity consumption as a result of this energy price crisis. So just a quick note on energy prices. So for anyone who's interested in using the data that we're using, the smart meter data, the consumption data is very clean, nice to work with, but there are the rawest element of the data is prices. So there's a lot of work we had to do here in order to define what we call the fixed and variable tariffs. We had to identify them, who's on a fixed tariff and a variable tariff by the price information that we have alone. So we don't have any information about tariffs, and we only have irregular price collection compared to consumption. But it's good news in terms of looking at whether the prices on average are close to what is reported by, for example, DESNAS. So what do the prices look like for these two groups? So again, the counterfactual group or our control group is defined by this blue line. And since they're on a fixed tariff throughout the entirety of our sample, they don't change. Whereas those who are on a fixed tariff before, we see an explosion in the electricity prices post-April 2022. And each time there's a price cap up till the end of mid-2023 when prices started to come down again. And we see a similar picture for gas expenditure or gas prices between these two groups as well. So we use this natural experiment, or essentially the randomization of households in particular, to tease out the causal effect of the energy price crisis on consumers. So we know there are around about 2 million households were forced onto a new supplier and therefore a standard variable tariff if their supplier went bust. If households' contracts had ended, for better or worse, they had little incentive to switch. So even if you wanted to go back to a fixed tariff, you were unable to do so because switching based on price alone essentially collapsed because it became unprofitable. And even some switching mechanisms actually were removed from the market. So we use these features of the natural experiment, which provides some random movement of consumers, in particular, or more specifically, from those who were previously on a fixed tariff to those who were on a variable tariff during the energy price crisis and therefore exposed. So the key thing you might be thinking to yourself, well, are these two groups similar? Are we able to compare them in terms of their gas and electricity consumption? Again, thinking about that counterfactual, or whether there is some kind of world we can rely upon in which energy price crisis may not have occurred, i.e. relying on those households who were not exposed to the price increases for that period of time. And in this case, due to the randomization or the natural experiment we're relying on, we actually find very similar household characteristics, property characteristics, and also regional characteristics. There are some slight differences in terms of the temperature of the regions that these two groups live in. So we make sure we control for this, not only using temperature, but also fixed. We control for regional fixed effects in our regressions as well. So the data, we use data that's contained in a secure observatory called the Smart Energy Research Lab that's organized by UCL and can be accessed via UKDS. It's representative sample, as good as representative as it can be, of around about 13,000 GB households. It's high frequency data that's aggregated up to the daily aggregation for many reasons, partly to make it more tractable in terms of estimations. We're already using millions of observations using daily data, but also to get over the issue that smart meters are not always that smart, as we know from recent news. So the daily aggregation can kind of get over some of these particular caveats. We control, like I said before, temperature, so dynamic factors, but also static factors are contained in surveys and follow-up surveys of household and property characteristics, as well as EPC ratings as well, contained in the EPC certificates. So like I've already alluded to, we use this natural experiment and econometric techniques to capture the causal effect of the energy price crisis. In particular, the differences in the fixed versus variable rates consumption pre-post the April price cap. And we do many robustness checks, checking for things like parallel trends, anticipation effects, and so on. So for anyone who's interested in this type of analysis, you can reach out to us via email, and I'm sure we can answer your questions or in the Q&A at the end. So our findings, the energy price crisis we find caused the daily electricity consumption to fall around about 5% on average, gas consumption by 32%. But the thing that we're most interested in is the second part, that for those who are exposed to the tariffs, they actually saw an additional 14 percentage point decrease in gas and 10 percentage point decrease in electricity. And we see this consistently over many different specifications compared to those on fixed rates. So there is a large welfare effect in terms of the amount of electricity and gas that consumers would have liked to have consumed had the energy price crisis not occurred. We separate these results out by deprivation and also consumer behavior. For those who are living in highest levels of multiple deprivation, they actually consume even less gas than the average household. And for those who are really putting in a lot of effort to reduce their consumption through methods such as putting on extra clothing instead of turning on the heat, switching off lights in rooms that are not being used, and also stating that they are putting in a lot of effort to reduce their consumption, but also consuming less gas than what we find in the average statistics in our main estimations. So to kind of get a more intuitive understanding of the effects, we look at expenditure rather than consumption, and we find that on average, around households who are on standard variable tariffs spend an additional £132 per year. That's on top of what they would have spent had they compared to the typical household. And for those on SVTs compared to fixed tariffs, spend an additional £200. So on average, it's around about £333 per year for those who are on SVTs compared to the counterfactual group. So it's a substantial amount of money. And this is the first time we actually have a handle on expenditure or the expenditure effect, taking into account behavioral factors, because here we're relying on actual data compared to, let's say, typical domestic consumption values that extrapolate away behavioral considerations. So policy implications. So some brief policy implications that come out of this research. Households exposed to the energy price crisis, obviously they consume significantly less than what they would like to have. And this is particularly concerning for those who are already at the limit of their budget constraint. You know, those who are already at the limit, if they cut back further, we've seen in our other research, there are issues related to their health and well-being that we needed to consider. But also households who are unable to cut back further, they may have cut back on other goods and services, either depleted savings or incurred additional debt, as we've seen in the statistics we presented earlier as well. In terms of higher income households, there may be an incentive to install energy saving measures or low cost technology or low carbon technologies. Now, this is potentially a silver lining in the sense that it will expose the energy system to less volatility, or households to less volatility to energy price crises that may occur in the future, but also depending on whether there's some rebound effects, reduced carbon emissions from households as well. And thank you for listening. As Monica said, we'll be happy to take questions at the end.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. I think we'd now like to hand over to Michael Harker and Paula Kohn. Michael is at Queen Mary University of London, Paula, Sheffield Hallam University. So over to you. I think we'll start with Michael.
Okay, can I just check you can see my slides? Is that
confirmed? Yes.
Okay, thank you. So just moving on then, this part of the project really was aiming to look at, to be a little bit more forward-looking, to look at the legal, institutional and policy kind of implications of moving towards net zero. So that's really what our focus is. We've got two parts to this presentation. We're going to talk a little bit in very brief terms about the nature of the net zero targets, challenge rather, and what it means, the implications in terms of transformation for the energy sector. And I'm going to talk you through as well what I've kind of pieced together in terms of the new institutional framework in terms of regulation. It's moving quite quickly, this area. We've obviously got a new government and there's been several initiatives since the King's speech, etc. So hopefully have some updates on that basis. And then Paula's going to present some empirical work. This was some in-depth interviews we did with some 7 elite participants. This was in the latter part of 2023, but some really interesting insights there. So in terms of the transformation of the energy sector, then many of you will be very familiar with this. A transformation, that's the term that's used in terms of energy generation, not just the supply side though, but also on the consumption side. It's reliant upon consumers changing their behavior and a high level of engagement on the part of consumers if we're actually going to achieve net zero. We'll define that in a moment. Switch away from gas to green technologies. We'll see a very steep increase in terms of the demand for electricity, and that needs to be managed as part of the planning. We've got to deal with the problem of intermittency, given that we're moving towards wind, solar, etc. So we'll be relying more on smart technology and also storage. And also we need more dynamic transmission and distribution network, which will require further very significant investment. So those are the key kind of themes emerging out of these, the challenges of the transformation. So in terms of the legislative context, very briefly, we've got the Climate Change Act, and there's a commitment there in statute that there'll be 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. A commitment that's made in international law as well. For the energy sector, though, that target has been brought forward very significantly. So the Johnson government made this in 2022. By 2035, we will have decarbonised our electricity system subject to security of supply. The Labour government then has brought this forward to 2030. So a really ambitious target, which in terms of infrastructure, investment, is not that far away. What does this mean then? As I said a moment ago, a real steep increase in terms of electricity demand. So these figures are a little bit dated now, but 50% increase by 2035. We'll need a sharp increase in terms of investment. These from the Climate Change Committee, 50 billion annually by 2030. So a real, as I said, an investment challenge. The Labour government, sort of just a quick update, have made a number of proposals on this front. The setting up of the Great British Energy Company, I think you'll have heard a lot about in the news. Other initiatives as well going forward, something to watch. Just to rewind a little bit, I said about the institutional architecture, that's a key focus of this part of the project. It seems like a long time ago, but actually when you look at the date, it isn't that far ago. The House of Lords Industry and Regulators Committee, I'd recommend this as a good starting point if you want to read around the challenges of some of this. They did a really in-depth, really detailed investigation of the challenges of meeting what was then the 2035 objective for the energy sector, made a number of recommendations across the piece, but focused as well on the institutional background, looked at the role of Ofgem, thought that Ofgem's kind of role should be limited really to economic regulation and consumer protection, although it should have a net zero duty. That's actually been implemented in legislation now. They agreed with what was being then put forward by the government and Ofgem, the creation of what's called the Future Systems Operator. I'll come back to that in a moment. But one of the things that they did do, and I've highlighted it there, they talked about there being, you know, the ambition on the one hand, but there being an insufficient coordination and strategic direction in relation to the target, in translating these ambitions, high-level targets into detailed deliverable policy. So their solution, one that was rejected by the government at the time, was to create a government task force essentially to take this forward. They were quite, I mean, the debate in the committee and in the evidence before the committee really was focusing on this question about who decides these important trade-offs that we're making within the energy trilemma. You know, these are essentially political trade-offs. So this wasn't a matter for independent regulators, but really for the government. But this poses a question which we'll kind of come back to at the end about who decides on these trade-offs and how are these trade-offs and the decision on those trade-offs communicated to an independent regulator. So one of a key reports, 2023, the Skidmore report, recommended an office for net zero delivery, again along the lines of what the House of Lords were reporting. That again, the government didn't take that on at the time, but we did see the Department of for Energy Security and Net Zero being set up by the Sunak government. We also saw a very significant piece of legislation, one of the most significant pieces of legislation for energy in 10 years or so, the Energy Act 2023, and also the issuing of a strategic policy statement. This is a mechanism for within that, the differing objectives of the regulators, how to kind of deal with some of those potential kind of trade-offs between different objectives. So that's a strategic policy statement, the SPS. I've tried to kind of summarize this in a slide just to show the complexity of the institutional framework now. I'm not going to speak to each of the points because there's not time, but just to kind of sketch out all of the different actors in this system. We've got the Climate Change Committee that's advising Parliament basically on the carbon budgets. The carbon budget set by the Secretary of State. That's obviously across all economic activity, but there's a section of the budget which is specific to energy. It's important to bear in mind that that's where the ambitions, the key kind of ambitions in terms of net zero are set out. So those are really important starting points in terms of the implementation of policy. Then from the department to Ofgem, Ofgem's kind of role hasn't changed significantly in statutory terms. Its powers haven't been expanded, but now we have the SPS, the Strategic Policy Statement. Remember that mechanism by which the government kind of communicates to the regulator how it wants policy to be implemented. And now we've got this new layer of regulation, what was referred to as the Future Systems Operator, what's now called the National Energy System Operator. It's a hybrid regulator in the sense that it's a licensee on the one hand, it's inheriting the licenses from the national grid, but it's also a regulator. So it's a slightly odd kind of conception of regulation, but its role really is to take on this planning, this whole system planning approach to developing the network. It's a publicly owned corporation. It's got specific statutory duties, so it's kind of an odd kind of conception of a regulator. How do things are kind of, it's a moving feast at the moment. We've got the Central Strategic Network Plan, which is an initiative between the department, Ofgem, and the National Energy Systems Operator. That's actually stalled at the moment, but the new government have put in place what's called mission control. Mission control is essentially the idea of a cross-departmental, cross-cutting kind of body headed by Chris Stark, who is the ex-CEO of the Climate Change Committee. That's really to bring together all of these different actors within the system. The government officials, Ofgem, NESO, and also energy firms. So it's a moving picture, if you like, but this is just a summary of what we've got, where we've kind of arrived at. I just want to make a couple of quick observations. In terms of consumers, I mean, this is one of the things maybe that hasn't been directly kind of addressed. There will be, as we've looked in terms of the research that Monica and Andrew have presented, we know that there will always be winners and losers. And this may become more pronounced actually when we're talking about transition, which will rely on consumers actually engaging with the process, making investments themselves in new technology, heat pumps, solar panels, etc., etc. These are likely to be better off consumers who have access to the kind of resources to make those investments. And also that there's another question that's kind of bubbling under the surface about who really pays for these new investments in terms of the infrastructure. Is it the taxpayer, or bill payers. And obviously, if it's bill payers, that potentially has very regressive effects. And finally, this question, it's a perennial question in terms of regulation, who decides? And there is always this gap. I've just pulled out a couple of quotes there. The first one by Jonathan Brearley, talking about Ofgem and its role. I do not think it's right for the regulator to make the big economic trade-offs on the one hand, but then looking at the SPS, some of the responses to the consultation on the SPS is it wasn't clear enough about how the regulators should actually make some of those trade-offs within the energy trilemma. And basically the government came back and said this was really, for the regulators, they have liberty to decide which of these priorities take this statement avoids using any hierarchy that leaves this to the discretion of Ofgem and NESO. The important point here is that there may be a gap in terms of how these things are structured. I'll pass over now to Paula, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the results from the interviews.
Hi there. So I'm aware of the time constraints, so I'll try to be quick and but continuing with what Michael was saying, during these interviews that we did around October and November last year, we interviewed, among our interviewees, there were a member of parliament. We also interviewed regulators at an energy company, directors of the regulator, a senior consultant at Ofgem, a senior leader of Ofgem. So among them, we tried to ask them some questions that we divided into three groups, three main themes that, as you can see here on this slide. So we are trying to understand how they see the role of the regulator in light of net zero. What should be the ideal interrelations, and if there should be some interrelations between regulator and government, and also issues around fairness and affordability in achieving net zero. So the main findings around these interviews were that we do need a more proactive and interventionist approach, which resonates with what Michael was saying about mission control and how we need to accelerate things and make decisions quicker. There's a need for more strategic coordination. They agree that regulator and government need to talk more effectively. Although there's a need of independence, there's also the need to take accountability on their actions. So both Ofgem and government need to be clear about what their actions are. And they also highlighted the need for balancing fairness and affordability and be more flexible in terms of the framework, which Michael was showing the framework previously. I think they help answering a few of the answers we were looking at. If you could perhaps move to the next slide for me, please, Michael. You can see some of the quotes that illustrates how they think about what should be a more dynamic interventionist approach. They think there should be more independence from industry in doing what they need, what needs to be done to achieve net zero, but there's also a need to make sure that the tools that are in place already are enough, and some of them think that they are enough to promote effectively the plans that they are trying to implement. If we think about the interrelations between government and regulator, some interviewees agree that there is some interactions that are needed and more effectively, as I mentioned before, and they should focus more in high-level outcomes, affordability, security, reliability, as you can read from there. In terms of fairness and achieving net zero, they were also keen to reflect upon what should be the best approach towards the most vulnerable. And I think because of the time, I will pass it on to Michael because he can make some reflections out of these findings. So
I'll actually stop there so we can leave time for questions. I think we've made most of the kind of conclusions along with the talk. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we will move on to the comments stage of the session. I'd like to invite, if it's technically possible, someone from NEA to come in and comment if they would like to. And if so, maybe raise your hand, and Peter Courage might be able to bring you in. Okay. Yeah. Dion.
Hello. Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, great.
Hi, yes, I'm Dion from National Energy Action. I'm one of the policy analysts here on our policy team. Just a couple of brief reflections. I'm more keen to hear if anyone else has questions, but everything we've heard across the presentations today has been extremely relevant to the discussions that we're having on a day-to-day basis. I think in particular the middle section by Andrew as well is quite informative for when we're considering future developments in the regulatory space. So one thing I have in mind when I'm hearing about the impact of the energy price crisis with regards to diverging costs on a standard variable tariff and fixed term contracts is what will happen in the near future when we have policies implemented like market-wide half-hourly settlement. Inevitably, as we move towards net zero and bring more renewables online, tariffs as they are now lucrative for consumers, so you're likely to find some degree of divergence. And I think it's going to be extremely helpful to have the information that's being presented today when we're considering what kind of reforms might need to happen on a regulatory level. That was mostly all I wanted to comment. It was just the relevance of the research. I'm really appreciative for the opportunity to make a brief remark today. For now, I'll pass it back.
Okay.
Sean,
Thank you very much, Dion.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry to step in, but I noticed one comment in the chat that basically said what you are, if I understood the comment, what you're showing us is that prices are a good tool for conservation. And I would qualify the comment to say that also what we're trying to highlight is that for some people, conservation can be dangerous. So we need to distinguish between different type of consumers, but certainly there's no underlying idea in our research that energy is a God-given right, and that for some people reacting to prices is an obvious way of dealing with the crisis, and including taking measures that can protect them if they're able to do so.
Right. Thank you very much, Monica, for jumping in on that. I was thinking the same thing. So maybe it would be if I don't see other questions coming in, I will ask one, which is for Andrew. I noticed that you found electricity prices for the forced to switch group, if I can call them that, seem to be lower than for the control group, if I understood correctly the figures. But for the gas group, the forced to switch prices were higher. And if that's, maybe I misunderstood, but if that's correct, I wondered if you had an explanation for that.
Yeah, it's a good question, Sean. And the main explanation is just there is some inherent variability in the sample. So what you're seeing are a point estimates or means for each of these groups. So there is some difference, but there's no statistical difference between these prices. So although they look different from a visual point of view, from a statistical point of view, they're the same. I mean, that's backed up in several ways. You know, we look for example, testing parallel trends and so on. But if you look at the socioeconomic makeup or demographics of these groups, they're very similar. So just from a price point of view, yeah, you can consider them the same. It's just from a visual perspective, they look like there is some differences, that's all.
Okay. And then I think we've got a question online, which is how much discussion is there of a combination of tools that economists might propose, such as something like guaranteed income, but setting prices free, at both using multiple tools?
Yeah, I can give this a go, and then maybe Monica can jump in too. So I think there is a long-standing discussion of what policy measures are useful for protecting consumers going forward. Now, you might already know that Ofgem has made the move to protect one group of consumers in particular, that's those on prepayment meters. So the energy price guarantee was extended for a certain period of time to remove the price premium paid by prepayment meter users. And it's something that National Energy Action have pushed for, ourselves, papers have also pushed for some kind of rebalancing of this inherent unfairness that prepayment meter users were paying extra purely on the basis of using a particular payment method. So there is some protection still for consumers, but the question is, what are the protections are useful going forward? And obviously there's a massive discussion about whether winter fuel payments are one aspect of that, in terms of using a subsidy or income transfer to help consumers during cold weather spells. And from what Monica's presentation alluded to, there should be let's say a better targeted approach than what we've seen from the current government, just relying on basic income or measures based on household income. The key, I think, aspect going forward is thinking about social tariffs, which for a period of time, especially during the energy price crisis, was really starting to take or gain some traction. And I think the current government really needs to go back and have a careful look. The same with Ofgem as well, and maybe Michael's presentation maybe alludes to whether there is some potential communication that needs to be had between multiple stakeholders about how to introduce an effective social tariff for households in the energy market, similar to that in the water sector.
Okay, thank you. Monica, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Just a brief addition, which is, again, clarification about the British system compared to other ones. One of the challenges, aside from the complexities that Michael has highlighted in his talk, is that social security and energy are generally considered to be separate issues. There's no good coordination, and therefore trying to address these issues becomes complicated if we're thinking in terms of guaranteed income and how that might relate to affordability of energy.
Okay, thank you. Another, Paula.
Can I just make a quick comment? I think what Andrew and Monica just explained here ties really well with one of our findings in relation to how much consumer engagement is relevant, is crucial for achieving net zero with fairness, but probably the most vulnerable won't be able to do so. And what one of our concerns is how can we balance this affordability with the whole plan. So we got some findings that tie really well together with this too, I believe.
Thank you, Paula. And now we'd like to move online again for another question, which is directed to Andrew. Did you see a greater reduction in electricity consumption for those households that were using electric heating compared to gas heating?
Again, it's another good question. Now, even though we're using a large sample that's based on smart meter data, we are relying on let's say, a relatively smaller proportion of households who are on a fixed tariff for an extended period of time. So even though we've managed to do some heterogeneous analysis or analysis by different subgroups, for example, by index of multiple deprivation and also by consumer behavior, it's not always possible to break down the sample into subgroups. Now, with electric heating, we've looked at this. We control for electric heating in the main regressions when we're using our pooled analysis, and it doesn't change things. But interestingly, when we break down the sample by gas and electricity users, the effects, I think, if I remember correctly, are more relevant for those who use both gas and electricity over and above those who are using electric heating only. So we need to explore this in a bit more detail, because I think there's a widely held understanding that those who are on electric only or live in electric only properties are sometimes some of the more vulnerable households in a private accommodation or social housing. So it's a good question, Peter, and it's something that we would absolutely love to explore further.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Now I guess I'd like to make sure that UKirk deserves very substantial recognition for its support of this project. So I think everyone here among the researchers would very much like to thank UKirk for having supported over a good period of time this work. It was instrumental in the work being possible, and again reiterate thanks to the NEA, and maybe I'd like to hand over to Monica at this point, perhaps in case she has some closing words.
Thank you, Sean. Once again, I hope that the illustration of the work we've been doing has started a conversation. I guess we have colleagues and stakeholders present at this presentation, and certainly we all continue to work on these matters, and we are keen to offer our expertise wherever it might be useful to develop this dynamic sector. So I would say my closing words are to thank my colleagues for the excellent work, the support we received from CCP, from UKirk, from NEA, and add the wish that this is just the start of a conversation that we will be able to maintain with the participants and anyone that will look at our webinar later on.
Thank you very much, Monica. That's it for today.